There's a house on Maple Ridge Drive in Clarkston, Georgia, that people used to slow down to look at. Not because it was the biggest house on the street, though it was, and not because it had the most expensive car in the driveway, though it usually did. People slowed down because of the feeling the house gave you. Something warm. Something solid. Like if you looked at it long enough, you might start believing that the American dream was still real. That hard work still meant something. And that family, real family, could actually hold together in a world that seemed hell-bent on tearing everything apart. That house belonged to Dorothy and Raymond Calloway. Dorothy was 67 years old, with silver locks she wore pinned up on top of her head like a crown. She had the kind of face that had earned every line on it, laugh lines mostly, with a few worry lines carved in around her eyes that she called her children lines. She'd raised 4 kids in that house. Worked 31 years as a registered nurse at Piedmont Hospital. And stood beside Raymond through 2 recessions, 1 cancer scare, a bankruptcy in 1998 that nearly took everything, and the kind of quiet, grinding marital difficulties that most couples never survive. Raymond Calloway was 71, a retired civil engineer who still got up at 5:30 every morning out of habit. He was a big man, broad-shouldered even in his old age, with enormous hands that had built model bridges with his son Marcus when Marcus was 7, and held Dorothy's hand in the hospital when she got her biopsy results back the second time. He had a laugh that filled a room, and a temper that could clear one, though in his older years, he'd learned to keep that temper mostly leashed. Together they had built something rare. Not just wealth, though the wealth was real. Accumulated slowly and carefully over 4 decades of disciplined saving, smart property purchases, and the kind of financial restraint that people who grew up poor tend to develop like a second skin. Raymond's parents had been sharecroppers in Alabama. Dorothy's mother had cleaned other people's houses in Memphis until her knees gave out. Both of them had carried that history like a compass, always knowing which direction was down and being terrified of going back there by the time Raymond retired. The Calloways had assets worth approximately $2.3 million. The house on Maple Ridge was paid off. They owned 2 rental properties in Decatur. They had retirement accounts, savings bonds, a modest investment portfolio that Raymond monitored with the diligence of a man who had once watched everything disappear. They weren't flashy rich. They were the kind of rich that's invisible until it suddenly isn't, until somebody dies, or somebody gets sick, or somebody's name shows up on a piece of paper that has the word estate on it. They had 4 children. Marcus, the oldest at 44, was a high school football coach in Marietta. He was steady, responsible, a little boring in the way that deeply reliable people sometimes are. He called his parents every Sunday. He showed up to every family dinner. He fixed things around the house when Raymond's back got too bad to do it himself. He had a wife named Keisha, and 2 teenage boys, Deshaun and Malik. And he drove a 7-year-old Ford F-150 that he maintained with almost religious dedication. Simone, 41, was a pharmaceutical sales rep who lived in a beautiful townhouse in Buckhead with her boyfriend Antoine, who'd been her boyfriend for 6 years and would probably be her boyfriend for 6 more years. Because Simone had what Dorothy called a fear of forever. Simone was sharp-tongued, funny, professionally successful, and deeply anxious about money in a way that didn't match her income. She made good money. She spent better money. Her credit card debt was a secret she kept from everyone, including Antoine. Darius, 38, was the one people worried about. Not because he was a bad person, he wasn't, but because his potential had always been larger than his follow-through. He had a business degree from Georgia State that he'd used to open 3 different businesses in 10 years, each of which had started with great promise and ended with a quiet, embarrassing fizzle. Currently, he was in between things, which had been true for about 14 months. He lived in a 1-bedroom apartment in College Park. He borrowed money from his parents with enough regularity that both of them had stopped expecting repayment and started thinking of it as a kind of unofficial allowance. And then there was Tanya. Tanya was 35, the baby. And she was, there is no other word for it, her parents' favorite. Not in the petty, obvious way that favoritism sometimes works in families. It was more complicated than that. Tanya was simply the one who had stayed. She'd gone to school locally, gotten a social work degree, come back to Clarkston, and built her life within a 15-minute radius of her parents. She had dinner with them twice a week. She drove Dorothy to her doctor's appointments. She sat with Raymond in the evenings and watched old westerns with him. She had given them 2 grandchildren, Jasmine, 9, and little Ray, named for his grandfather, who was 5, and she had made the house on Maple Ridge feel, even in its later years, like it was still the center of something alive. Tanya's husband was a man named Greg Whitfield, and Greg Whitfield is where the real story begins. Greg Whitfield had what Dorothy always called a salesman's face. She'd said it the first time Tanya brought him home 10 years ago, and she'd said it in a neutral tone that could have meant anything. A salesman's face, open, charming, always arranged into the expression most likely to make you feel comfortable. Greg had dark eyes that crinkled at the corners when he laughed, which was often, and a handshake that was firm without being aggressive. And he said sir and ma'am with such natural ease that Raymond had lowered his guard within about 40 minutes of their first meeting. Greg worked in real estate. He was good at it, good enough to have made genuine money in the Atlanta market during the boom years, good enough to have bought Tanya a nice house in Stone Mountain, good enough to project the image of a man who was doing well with some authority. But Greg's relationship with money was complicated in ways that Tanya didn't fully understand until much later, and that his in-laws never understood at all. Greg had grown up in a middle-class family in Savannah, the son of a contractor who had done well until he didn't. And Greg had absorbed 2 contradictory lessons from his childhood: that money was the measure of a man, and that money was fundamentally unstable. He was simultaneously obsessed with wealth and terrified of it disappearing. This combination made him a good real estate agent. He understood the emotional weight of property and a quietly dangerous presence in a family with significant assets and aging patriarchs. He had started noticing the Calloway assets within the first year of his marriage to Tanya, not in a sinister way. Initially, it was more like the professional habit of a man who spent his days thinking about property values and net worth. He noticed the Decatur rental properties and estimated their current market value. He noticed when Raymond mentioned, casually, that the retirement accounts had done well that year. He filed these things away without fully acknowledging, even to himself, why he was filing them. The shift happened when Greg's real estate business hit a serious downturn in 2022. The Atlanta market had gotten complicated, interest rates rising, inventory tightening, his client base shrinking, and Greg/had made some bad investments in a commercial property venture that had quietly become catastrophic. By early 2023, he was carrying $340,000 in personal debt, a fact that Tanya did not know, that his parents-in-law certainly did not know, and that Greg had spent considerable energy concealing. It was in this state of concealed desperation that Greg Whitfield began to think seriously about the house on Maple Ridge Drive. Raymond had a heart attack in March of 2023. It was mild. As heart attacks go, he was lucky, the doctors said. Which is a strange kind of luck, and he recovered well enough to come home after 5 days. But it shook the family in the way these things do. It made the abstract suddenly concrete. It put a shape on something that had been shapeless. Dorothy, who was practical in the bone-deep way that nurses tend to be, sat down with Raymond 2 weeks after he came home and said, "We need to update the will." They had a will, of course. They were not careless people, but the existing will was 15 years old and reflected a family situation that had changed considerably. They called their attorney, a man named Harold Webb, who had handled their legal affairs for 20 years, and they spent an afternoon going over everything. The plan they settled on was straightforward. The house on Maple Ridge would pass to all 4 children equally, to be sold and the proceeds divided, unless the children agreed unanimously to another arrangement. The Decatur rental properties would be split between Marcus and Darius, the 2 who had expressed some interest in property management. The financial accounts would be divided 4 ways equally. There were some specific bequests: a set of china for Simone, Raymond's tools and workshop equipment for Marcus, certain jewelry for Tanya, but broadly. The estate was to be divided equally among the 4 children. Tanya was the one who drove her parents to Harold Webb's office. She sat in the waiting room while they were inside. She didn't ask what they'd decided, and they didn't tell her in detail. It wasn't a secret exactly. They mentioned the broad strokes at a family dinner a few months later, but the specifics of the will, the exact distribution, the names of accounts and their values, those remained private. Greg, however, was a man who paid attention. He had driven Dorothy to one of her follow-up appointments when Tanya had a conflict with work. This was the kind of thing Greg did. The kind of thing that made him look, to the outside eye, like an exemplary son. Dorothy had a medical folder she carried to appointments. A thick manila envelope with insurance cards and records and paperwork. And when she left it on the back seat of Greg's car by accident and he returned it to her the next day, he had not looked at the contents. But 2 weeks later, when Dorothy left a folder on the kitchen counter while they were all having Sunday dinner, a folder that turned out to be from Harold Webb's office, containing a summary of the estate plan, Greg saw it. He was helping clear the table. He was alone in the kitchen for about 4 minutes. He read quickly. He was good at reading quickly. He put the folder back exactly where it was. He didn't say a word. But from that point forward, Greg Whitfield's thinking about the Calloway estate shifted from the vague to the specific. He now knew the numbers. He now knew the structure. And he now knew, with the clarity of a desperate man who has just been handed a map to a treasure, exactly what he was working with. Part 4. The plan inside the key and Acesta. Thing about Greg's plan, the thing that made it so effective, at least initially, was that it was built entirely out of things that looked like love. He started by becoming even more indispensable to Dorothy and Raymond. He offered to take over their grocery runs on weekends. He started stopping by on Tuesday evenings to check on Raymond, bringing takeout from the soul food place on 5th that Raymond liked. He helped Raymond sort through some old paperwork in the study one Saturday, which gave him the opportunity to see, with his own eyes, the filing system Raymond used for financial documents, where things were kept, how they were organized. He began, carefully, to cultivate a specific dynamic with Dorothy. He would bring her coffee in the mornings when they stayed over, the way she liked it, 2 sugars, a splash of cream. He would compliment her cooking with the kind of specific, genuine-seeming detail that distinguishes flattery from appreciation. He would ask her opinion on things, listen to the answers, remember them. Dorothy, who was sharp, who had spent 67 years reading people, found herself thinking that she had perhaps been too quick to apply that salesman's face label. Maybe Greg was simply a man who had taken time to mature in parallel. Greg began working on Tanya. Their marriage had been going through a quiet, low-grade difficulty for about 2 years. Nothing dramatic, no infidelity, no screaming fights. Just the slow accumulation of distance that happens between two people who are busy and stressed, and not quite talking about the things that matter. Greg, in the spring of 2023, suddenly became the husband Tanya had been missing. He was present. He was attentive. He took the kids to their activities without being asked. He made dinner twice a week. He suggested a weekend trip to Savannah. Just the two of them. And it was wonderful in the way that their early years had been wonderful. And Tanya came back from that trip feeling like something had been restored. She didn't know she was being prepared. The first concrete step in Greg's plan came in June of 2023. When he approached Raymond with the business proposition, he framed it carefully. He had been talking to some developers, he said, about a mixed-use property project in the Decatur area. Good location, strong projected returns. He was looking for a partner investor, someone with some capital and some patience. Because these things took time, but the returns were solid. He wasn't asking Raymond to invest everything, just to consider it as a diversification play. Something that could grow over the next 5 to 7 years. Raymond listened. Raymond was not a fool. He had survived a bankruptcy and 3 decades of financial discipline, and he did not hand his money to anyone, family included, without thinking carefully. He said he would think about it. He mentioned it to Dorothy that night. Dorothy said, "I don't know, Raymond. Greg's business has always made me a little nervous." Raymond said, "He's done well in Atlanta," Dorothy said. Doing well and being trustworthy are different things. Raymond said he would think more about it. He ultimately said no. Greg took this gracefully. He didn't push, didn't sulk, didn't let the rejection change his behavior. He kept bringing takeout on Tuesdays. He kept being the attentive husband and the dutiful son. He simply absorbed the setback and adjusted his approach. The direct investment route was closed. He needed a different angle. He found it through Simone. Part 5. The weakest case. Simone Calloway had a lifestyle problem. Not a dramatic one, no addiction, no scandal, just the ordinary, excruciating problem of spending more than she earned in a way that had built up over about 8 years, into a genuine financial crisis. She owed $67,000 on 4 credit cards. She had a personal loan she was struggling to service. She had been declined for a consolidation loan 6 months earlier, and the rejection had shaken her badly. Nobody in her family knew. This was the thing Simone guarded most carefully, more carefully, even than she guarded her relationships or her professional reputation. In a family of achievers, in a family where financial prudence was practically a religion, being in debt felt like a moral failing. It felt like something that would change how her parents looked at her. And Simone could not bear the thought of that. Greg had suspected Simone's financial situation for about 2 years. You get a feel for these things in real estate. The slightly strained way certain people talk about money. The specific kind of avoidance that signals embarrassment rather than disinterest. He had confirmed it, more or less, through a conversation with Antoine at a family barbecue where Antoine had said, a little too casually, that they were scaling back on vacation plans this year, in July of 2023. Greg called Simone. He said he had a proposition that he wanted to run by her before going to the family. He said he was thinking about suggesting to Dorothy and Raymond that they restructure how the rental properties were managed, bring in professional management, optimize the income, maybe position them for sale at the right moment for maximum return. He thought Simone, as the business-minded one, might be a good advocate for this idea. He just wanted to get her thoughts. Simone, who was business-minded, engaged with this genuinely. They talked for 40 minutes. She had good ideas about property management. Greg listened, complimented her analysis, said she really understood this stuff better than the rest of the family. Then, almost as an afterthought, he said, "You know, I've been running some numbers on the estate's overall structure. If everything is set up right, there's actually a way for the family to see significantly better returns both now and when the time comes. But it would involve some consolidation of a power of attorney structure, maybe a family trust. Have you ever thought about that?" Simone said she hadn't thought about it specifically, but it made sense in theory. Greg said he would put some information together. He did a carefully constructed document that mixed legitimate estate planning information with some strategically positioned suggestions about how a streamlined power of attorney structure could benefit the family. 3 weeks later, he sent Simone a second document. This one included a suggestion that he and Tanya, as the family members most actively involved in the parents' day-to-day lives, might be appropriate candidates for power of attorney. And that Simone, given her financial expertise, could serve as a kind of family financial advisor in this structure. With, Greg added very casually, some compensation for her time and expertise. Not much, maybe a small percentage of managed assets. Enough to be meaningful. For a woman who was $67,000 in debt, enough to be meaningful was a live wire. Simone didn't say yes. But she didn't say no. She said she would think about it. That was enough for Greg. Marcus was the problem. Greg had known from the beginning that Marcus would be the hardest. Marcus was the oldest, the most protective of his parents. The one whose Sunday phone calls always included a careful, quiet assessment of how Dorothy and Raymond were doing. Marcus had a stillness about him, the stillness of someone who had played a lot of chess and football, and understood that patience was the most important strategy there was. Greg had tried, early on, to build the same kind of rapport with Marcus that he'd built with the others. It had not worked. Marcus was polite to Greg, always had been, but there was a reserve there, a watchfulness, that Greg could never quite get past. Marcus did not gossip, did not complain about money, did not reveal his vulnerabilities in social settings. He was, from a manipulation standpoint, nearly impenetrable. Greg decided not to approach Marcus at all. He simply excluded him from the planning. The strategy, which Greg had been quietly assembling for 6 months like a man building a machine in a closed room, was this: he would bring Tanya, Simone, and Darius to Dorothy and Raymond with a unified proposal to restructure the estate into a family trust. With Greg and Tanya designated as co-trustees, with power of attorney. The framing would be care and practicality. Raymond's health was uncertain. Estate taxes were a real concern. Professional management would protect and grow the assets. It would all be true enough to be plausible and incomplete, enough to be devastating. With 3 of the 4 children presenting a unified front, and with the months of groundwork Greg had laid with Dorothy and Raymond, the Tuesday takeout, the grocery runs, the careful, patient cultivation of trust, he believed he could get them to agree. Once the power of attorney was established, Once the trust was structured with Greg and Tanya as trustees, he could begin moving assets. Slowly at first. Legitimately at first. And then, when the time was right, in ways that would be much harder to track or challenge, he had a timeline. He had a lawyer, not Harold Webb, a different lawyer, a younger one who asked fewer questions. He believed, 3 willing siblings and 2 aging parents who trusted their daughter and her husband completely. What he did not have, what he had failed in his careful calculations to account for was Keisha. Part 8. What Keisha, Keisha Calloway was a high school English teacher, and she had the particular skill of all great English teachers. She listened to what wasn't being said. She had been at a family dinner in September of 2023, the whole family. A birthday dinner for Raymond, 68th birthday, and she had noticed things. Small things. The way Simone laughed too quickly at one of Greg's jokes. The way Darius kept looking at Greg when certain topics came up. A checking look, like a student checking the teacher's face for approval. The way Tanya seemed slightly nervous, slightly rehearsed, in a way she'd never been at family dinners before. And the way Greg watched Raymond and Dorothy. Keisha had seen a lot of things in her classroom over 20 years. She had learned to recognize the specific quality of attention that predators give to the vulnerable, the focused, calculating quality that looked like attentiveness from a distance but felt, up close, like something else entirely. She had seen it in certain teenage boys who targeted quieter classmates. She saw it now, across a birthday dinner table, in her brother-in-law's eyes. She didn't say anything that night. She drove home with Marcus and watched him talk about his dad's birthday and wondered if she was imagining things. She wasn't. Over the next 4 weeks, she started paying a different kind of attention. She called Simone. They had a decent relationship, not close, but solid, and had a conversation that was designed to sound casual, but wasn't. She asked about Greg's business. Asked it sideways, the way you do when you want information without tipping your hand. Simone, to her credit, gave nothing away, but the specific things she avoided saying told Keisha enough. She called Darius and took him to coffee. Just the 2 of them, which was unusual enough that Darius seemed slightly off balance. She asked him how the catering idea was coming. He brightened immediately, started talking. She let him talk. She asked, "Are you working with Greg on the business side of that, or?" and watched his face do something complicated. "We've talked about some options," Darius said carefully. "What kind of options?" Keisha asked. Darius changed the subject. On a Tuesday evening in October, Keisha drove to Maple Ridge Drive alone, without Marcus. She told Dorothy and Raymond she was just stopping by, which was not something she did often enough to be routine, but not so rarely as to be alarming. Dorothy made tea. Raymond was in the den, watching his westerns. Keisha sat at the kitchen table with Dorothy and chose her words with the same care she brought to teaching literature, knowing that the way you frame a thing determines what people are able to see. "Mama." "Dorothy," she said. She had always called her that. "Have you and Daddy Raymond talked recently with a lawyer about your estate?" "Like, recently?" "In the last few months." Dorothy looked at her over her teacup. "We updated everything last year. With Harold." "Why? Have you talked to anyone else about maybe restructuring things? A family trust, power of attorney, anything like that?" Dorothy set down her cup. "No. Should we have?" Keisha said, "I'm not sure. I might be wrong about this, but I think there might be some conversations happening in the family that you're not aware of. And I think you should be." Part 9. The CONFONTATO and Dorothy did not do anything impulsively. She was not that kind of woman. She waited for days. She talked to Raymond, who listened with the stillness of a man who has been through hard things and knows how to hold difficult information without immediately reacting to it. She called Harold Webb and asked him, without explaining exactly why, to come by the house. And then she called Marcus. Marcus came on a Saturday morning. He sat with his parents and Harold Webb at the dining room table, the same table where 30 years of family dinners had happened, where homework had been done, where Raymond had sat up late some nights working on household finances, and Harold Webb walked them through what a fraudulent power of attorney scheme would look like, what to watch for, what the legal vulnerabilities were. Marcus listened to all of it. His face was very still. Then he said, "Has Greg ever asked you directly about the estate? About the will, or your accounts, or the properties?" Raymond said, "He tried to get me to invest in something last June. I said no." Marcus nodded slowly. "Has he talked to you about restructuring anything? A trust? A power of attorney?" "No," Dorothy said. "But Keisha seems to think someone was planning to." Marcus picked up his phone and called Tanya. He didn't tell her everything. He just asked her to come to the house. He said it was important, that it was about Mom and Dad, that she needed to come now. Tanya, who had no reason to suspect what was happening, got in her car and drove to Maple Ridge Drive. What happened next is the kind of family moment that doesn't have a clean shape. It's not a scene, it's a rupture. Tanya walked into her parents' dining room and found her parents, her oldest brother, Harold Webb, and an atmosphere she didn't recognize. Something taut and serious and directed at her, in a way she didn't understand. Marcus said, "Tell me what Greg has been talking to you about." "About Mom and Dad's estate," Tanya said. "What?" Marcus said, "I need you to tell me exactly what Greg has said to you about restructuring Mom and Dad's estate, about power of attorney, about a family trust." And watching Tanya's face in that moment, watching the confusion, then the dawning, then the something else, Dorothy understood several things simultaneously. That her daughter had known something, that her daughter had not fully understood what it was, and that her daughter was, in this moment, being broken open by the realization of what had been happening around her. Tanya sat down. "He said it was estate planning," she said. "He said it was to protect everyone." He said. She stopped. She pressed her hands flat on the table. "He had documents. He had talked to Simone and Darius. He said we were going to present it to you together as a family plan." She looked at her mother. I thought he was trying to help." Dorothy's face was the saddest thing Marcus had ever seen. "Baby," Dorothy said quietly, "Greg has $340,000 in debt that you don't know about." Tanya went completely still. "How do you?" "Harold ran a financial background check 2 days ago," Raymond said. "When we started to understand what might be happening." Tanya looked at Harold Webb. Harold Webb, who had known this family for 20 years, looked back at her with professional gentleness. "His real estate business has been in serious trouble for about 18 months, Harold said. "The debt is documented. It's real." The silence in the room had a quality Tanya would remember for the rest of her life. It was the silence of a world rearranging itself. They called Simone next. She drove over and walked into that same dining room and immediately knew something had collapsed. She could read rooms. It was one of her professional skills, and this room told her everything before anyone said a word. She sat down and looked at her mother and said, "I'm sorry." Dorothy said, "Tell me what happened." Simone told them everything. She told them about her own debt. She told them about Greg's approach, the documents, the offer of compensation. She told them exactly how she had been recruited. She was crying before she finished, and Dorothy was holding her hand by the end. Because Dorothy was that kind of mother, the kind who could be devastated and still hold you at the same time. "Why didn't you come to us?" Raymond said. Not angrily, just tiredly. "About the debt. Why didn't you just come to us?" Simone shook her head. She couldn't explain it in a way that would make sense to someone who had always been responsible, always been competent, always been the parent that other parents envied. She said, "I didn't want you to be disappointed." Raymond looked at his daughter for a long time. Then he said, "Simone, $60,000 in debt is not the worst thing that could happen to a person. What almost happened here is much worse. And you are not in trouble with us. Greg is." Simone cried harder. Darius came that afternoon. His confession was the most painful, in some ways, because the thing that had been used against him was the thing that hurt him most, his own frustrated ambition, his own sense of having always fallen short. Greg had found the exact right wound to press. Darius sat across from his father and could barely look at him. "I just wanted something to finally work," Darius said. Raymond reached across the table and gripped his son's hand. "I know," he said. "I know, son." Part 11. Greg comes at Tanya drove home that evening in a state that existed outside of ordinary emotion. She wasn't crying. She was past crying. She was in the cold, clear space on the other side of shock, where everything looks slightly too bright and slightly too sharp, and you understand things with a precision that is almost painful. Greg was home. He was in the kitchen making dinner, and he smiled when she walked in, that salesman's smile. The one Dorothy had named a decade ago, and asked how her parents were doing. Tanya set her purse on the counter. She said, "I know about the debt." The smile didn't disappear immediately. That was the thing she would remember. It shifted, took a fraction of a second to become something else, and in that fraction of a second, she saw the machinery behind it. The calculation, the adjustment. And in that moment, 10 years of marriage compressed into a single, devastating clarity. "What debt?" he said. $340,000, she said. "The commercial property investment. The business trouble. All of it." He put down the spatula. "Tanya, I'm also aware," she said, "that you have been meeting with my siblings without my parents' knowledge, presenting documents, talking about power of attorney, about restructuring their estate." Her voice was completely level. It was the most frightening voice she had ever used. "I'm aware that you were planning to present this to them as a unified family proposal. I'm aware that you recruited Simone by offering her financial compensation, and that you recruited Darius by promising him startup capital." Greg was very quiet. "I want you to understand something," Tanya said. "My parents know everything. Harold Webb knows everything. And Marcus knows everything, which means you need to understand what you are facing right now." She picked up her purse. "I'm taking the kids to my parents' house tonight. My mother's attorney is going to advise us on next steps. And I would strongly recommend that you think very carefully about what you do in the next 24 hours. Because every decision you make right now is going to determine what kind of future you have." She walked out of the kitchen. She did not look back. Part 12. The RCKONAG. What followed was not neat. Real reckonings never are. Greg retained a lawyer and initially attempted to minimize characterizing his conversations with Simone and Darius as family discussions about estate planning and denying any intent to defraud Harold Webb. On behalf of Dorothy and Raymond, made clear that the documented communications, texts, emails, the documents Greg had prepared with his other attorney, told a different story. There was no executed power of attorney, no transferred assets, no completed crime in the technical sense. But the intent was documented. The conspiracy was documented, and Harold Webb told Raymond, quietly, that if they chose to pursue civil action, there was a case. Raymond sat with that information for 3 days. Then he made a decision that surprised even Marcus. He said he didn't want to sue. He didn't want Greg in court. He didn't want the family in newspapers or court records. Didn't want Tanya's children, his grandchildren, to grow up with the word fraud attached to their father's name. He was an old man who had survived hard things, and he understood that some wounds, given the option, were better managed than reopened. What he wanted was protection and distance. Harold Webb restructured the estate, a proper family trust, ironically, the legitimate version of what Greg had been planning to exploit. The Decatur properties were placed under professional management. Financial oversight was formalized. Every change to the estate required dual signature. The documents were airtight, and Greg Whitfield was removed from every conversation, every family gathering, every Sunday dinner, every birthday, every holiday table. Not angrily, not with drama, with the cold, deliberate efficiency of people who have decided that a certain presence is no longer welcome and have chosen to enforce that decision completely. Tanya filed for divorce in November of 2023. The process was painful in the particular way that divorces are when they involve children. Jasmine at 9 was old enough to sense the shape of things without being able to name them. And little Ray at 5 simply knew that something was different, and responded with the clinginess of a child who can feel the ground shifting. Tanya handled it the way she handled everything, with her mother's particular brand of devastated competence. Doing what needed to be done, while giving herself space, at night, to come apart. Dorothy and Raymond made sure she knew she was not doing it alone. Part 13. Simone's Road BAC. Happened with Simone is worth telling. Dorothy sat with her daughter 2 weeks after everything came out and said, "How much is it?" Simone told her. "The full number, all of it," Dorothy said. "Your father and I are going to help you. Not because you deserve it right now. You know what you almost did, and you know why it was wrong, and you're going to have to carry that. But because debt is something we can fix, and that's what parents are for. Family is for. Not for taking from each other, but for helping each other out of holes." Simone sat there and let herself be held by a love she felt she hadn't earned. She paid the debt back, every dollar of what her parents gave her, over 4 years. She also went into therapy, which she had needed for much longer than she'd admitted. And the therapist helped her understand the particular shame spiral that had made her vulnerable to Greg's approach in the first place. The fear of being seen as a failure. The gap between image and reality. The exhaustion of maintaining the fiction. She also had a conversation with Antoine that was long overdue, and to his credit, Antoine didn't run. He sat with her through the whole story, the real one, and when she was finished he said, "Why didn't you trust me?" And she said, "Because I didn't trust myself." And they spent the next year figuring out how to build something more honest between them. Part 14. Darius finds his thing. Opened the catering company. Not with family money, he was clear about that, almost obsessively clear about it. He got a small business loan, pulled together some of his own savings, borrowed a little from a friend, and started small. Very small. Weekend pop-ups at community events. Word of mouth. Marcus was his first investor. Not a lot, $5,000, But Marcus wrote the check and said, "This is a loan. Pay me back whenever. But I believe you can do this." Darius's catering company, he called it Calloway's Table, found its niche in corporate lunch catering for small and mid-size Atlanta businesses. By the end of his second year, he was employing 6 people. By the end of his third year, he had paid Marcus back. He called his brother when the check cleared and Marcus didn't answer. So Darius left a voicemail that just said, "Paid in full, big bro. Thank you for believing in me. I'm going to be fine." Marcus played that voicemail 4 times. Part 15. Marcus and Keisha. Marcus and Keisha had a quiet evening, about a month after everything resolved, where Marcus sat in their kitchen and was uncharacteristically still for a long time. Keisha let him be still. She knew him well enough to know when he needed space to find words. Finally, he said, "I've been thinking about how close it was." "I know," she said. "If you hadn't noticed something at that birthday dinner." He stopped. "My parents could have lost everything," Keisha said. "But they didn't," Marcus said. "Because of you." She shook her head. "Because of how they raised us. All of us. Even Simone and Darius, they knew what they were doing was wrong. That's why they were so easy to feel out. Guilt is readable." Marcus was quiet. "I'm proud of how Mom and Dad handled it," he said. "The way Dad didn't want to take Greg to court. The way he paused. He still loves Tanya's kids. He still shows up for Jasmine and little Ray. He's not punishing them for what their father did." Keisha nodded. "That's who Raymond Calloway is." Marcus thought about his father, the big hands, the early mornings, the model bridges, the laugh that filled a room. He thought about what it meant to spend 40 years building something carefully. To have almost had it taken by someone who sat at your table and called you sir. He thought about how his father had refused to be defined by that almost "I want to be like him when I'm old." Marcus said. Keisha smiled. "You already are, baby. You already are." Part 16. TNY. The hardest part of Tanya's story is not the betrayal. Betrayal is, in the end, something that happens to you. The hardest part is what comes after the long work of rebuilding your own judgment, of learning to trust yourself again when your trust in yourself has been the casualty. Tanya spent a year in that work. She went to therapy. She leaned on her mother. She leaned on her siblings in ways she never had before, called Simone at 10 p.m. when she couldn't sleep. Let Marcus handle things she usually insisted on doing herself. Let Darius make her laugh with his catering stories even when laughing felt like something she wasn't entitled to yet. She was still in that house on Stone Mountain, which she'd received in the divorce settlement, and slowly she made it hers. Painted walls she'd always wanted to paint. Got a dog the kids had been asking for. Planted a garden in the backyard with Jasmine, who turned out to have her grandmother's particular patience with growing things. Little Ray asked about his father sometimes. Not constantly. Children are resilient in ways that can break your heart, but sometimes, in the way of a child who is trying to map the world. Tanya answered him honestly and simply, the way Dorothy had always answered hard questions, with as much truth as was appropriate for the age, and with the clear understanding that he was loved, and that being loved was the main thing. She started dating again after about 2 years, cautiously, with the new, harder-won judgment of a woman who understood that charm was not character, that attentiveness was not love, that the feeling of being taken care of was not the same as being safe. She didn't rush. She had her whole family with her. She had her parents, still alive, still in that house on Maple Ridge Drive that people slowed down to look at. She had enough. Part 17. Dorothy and Raymond Calloway turned 72 the following March. The birthday dinner was at the house on Maple Ridge, all 4 children. All the grandchildren, Keisha and Antoine. And a sense in the room of something that had been tested and found strong enough to hold. Dorothy made his favorite meal: smothered pork chops, rice and gravy, collard greens, cornbread, and a sweet potato pie that Raymond had been making pointed references to for 3 weeks. The house was full of noise and food, and the particular happiness of a family that has survived something together. After dinner, when the kitchen was cleaned and the grandchildren were watching a movie in the den, Raymond and Dorothy sat on their back porch the way they did most evenings. In the wooden rocking chairs Raymond had built himself 30 years ago. The Atlanta night was warm, and the yard was dark except for the string lights Dorothy had hung along the fence. And the sound of their grandchildren's laughter came through the screen door. Dorothy said, "How are you feeling?" Raymond said, "Like a man who's been blessed beyond what he deserved." She said, "You deserved it." He said, maybe some of it." He rocked slowly. "I keep thinking about what Harold said. That if we hadn't found out when we did, but we did find out," Dorothy said, "because of Keisha. Because we raised children who look out for each other." Raymond was quiet for a moment. "And one who almost didn't," Dorothy said. "Marcus and Simone and Darius were raised by the same people. Human beings make choices, Raymond. Some good ones and some bad ones. The important thing is what they do when they see clearly." He reached over and took her hand. They had been holding hands on this porch for 4 decades, through the bankruptcy and the cancer scare, and the children's various crises and the ordinary, daily work of building a life. The hand was different than it had been, older, softer, still the same hand. "I want to be buried in this yard," Raymond said suddenly. Dorothy said, "You are not dying." "I know I'm not dying. I just want to be buried here. Eventually, when I do." With the string lights on, Dorothy laughed. Really laughed, the way she used to when they were young, head back, shoulders shaking. "You can't be buried in the yard, Raymond. A man can dream," he said. She squeezed his hand. "You can dream," she said. They sat there in the warm evening, the lights strung along the fence, the sound of their grandchildren's laughter drifting through the screen door. Outside, on Maple Ridge Drive, a car slowed as it passed the house, someone seeing the lights, maybe, or just driving slowly the way people did in neighborhoods like this, where certain houses held a kind of gravity that you couldn't explain but couldn't ignore. The Calloways didn't see the car. They were looking at their yard, their lights, their night. They had survived. Epilogue. What family really means? There is a thing that happens in some families, a kind of creeping redefinition, where the word family comes to mean the people who share your blood, rather than the people who deserve your loyalty. Where proximity is confused for love, and habit is confused for commitment, and the assumption of permanence is confused for having actually earned someone's trust. Greg Whitfield had known the Calloways for 10 years. He had sat at their table, held their grandbabies, accepted their hospitality, and called Raymond Sir. And he had looked at what they had built, the careful, patient, remarkable thing they had built across 40 years of hard work and sacrifice and faith in each other, and seen not a family, but an opportunity. That is not a family member. That is a man who learned the language of family without ever understanding what it was for, what the Calloways understood, and what Greg, sitting alone in a 1-bedroom apartment in Marietta after the divorce was finalized, may have started to understand for the first time, is that family is not about what you can take. It is about what you show up to carry. It is Marcus calling every Sunday and fixing things with his big, careful hands. It is Simone crying at the kitchen table and saying I'm sorry to a mother who held her anyway. It is Darius making his first payroll and crying in his car because he finally had something to be proud of. It is Keisha sitting across from an old woman with a cup of tea and saying, carefully, I might be wrong about this, but I think you should know. It is Dorothy on the back porch, squeezing her husband's hand in the warm dark dot. It is Raymond's laugh filling a room. It is Tanya in her garden with her daughter, planting things they will watch grow. The house on Maple Ridge Drive still stands. People still slow down to look at it. The string lights are on most evenings now. Dorothy put them up along the fence and liked them so much she left them. The porch is often occupied. The driveway holds multiple cars on weekends, and if you slow down, if you really stop and look, you might feel it, that thing the house has always given people. That warmth, that solidity, that sense of something built on purpose, built to last. Built by people who understood that the most valuable things can't be stolen because they aren't stored in accounts or held in property. Records are written into wills. They're held in people. In the way people show up for each other. In the phone calls and the Sunday dinners and the cups of tea and the hands held in hospital hallways and the loans repaid and the forgiveness offered, not because it was earned but because love. Real love is not an accounting system. It is a choice. Made daily. Made even when, especially when, it costs something. The Calloways had made that choice for 4 decades. They would keep making it. The end.